Well, I get the privilege of bringing the message today. Pastor Roger couldn't be here this morning, so he asked if I could give the message, and of course I was very excited and very pleased to do that. If you don't know who I am, my name is Ryan Schinneller, and I'm the media director here at the church. And I think it's a wonderful thing to be a part of a church where the pastor will even entrust the media director to be to come up and deliver a message from the pulpit. So I think that's great. And I wanted to talk a little bit about perspectives, the way we view things. And so I wanted to start with a verse from 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 26. It says, "Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, 'What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?'" So this comes from a very, very famous biblical story, David and Goliath. I think everybody knows the story of David and Goliath. Even people who have never gone to church probably know the story of David and Goliath. You hear all the time in even television shows, and they'll talk about the Goliath of an industry, or they'll say this is a David and Goliath situation. And that's where this verse comes from. So you've got this guy David, who at this time is not a King David. This is Shepherd David. This is boy David, coming up against this giant who is the fiercest warrior of the entire Philistine army. And the Philistines were probably the fiercest army on the earth at the time. So this is one bad dude. And David just says, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of God?" Now, in perspective, the rest of the entire Israel army, who has been witness to miracles of God, who has been delivered from Egypt, who has done all kind of things and seen the power of God many, many times, they're all cowering in fear of one man. Like, you got the whole army, and they're scared of one guy, and then walks this shepherd boy, and you might think, oh, this guy's cocky. Maybe he's a little full of himself. He walks in and says, oh, who is this guy? I'll tell you what's going to be done for the guy who kills him? That's what I want to know. What can I get out of this? David had no fear of Goliath. Why? Well, if we look a few verses later, in that same chapter, verse 37, "Moreover, David said, 'The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine.'" David had absolute confidence, not in his own ability, but in the ability of God to deliver him. He saw this, and he had seen this other times in his life. He had seen it, obviously, when fighting a bear and when fighting a lion. I have seen God's deliverance. I have never seen it fighting a bear, and I have never seen it fighting a lion. And I am thankful that God has never put me in a situation where I'd have to rely on him to be delivered from a bear and a lion. So this is David. He has a perspective on the situation that the rest of Israel doesn't share. Now we're going to real quick jump over to someone else who had a different perspective of things. So in John chapter 11, verses 21 through 26, this is the story of Jesus with Lazarus. "Now Martha said to Jesus, 'Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you.' And Jesus said to her, 'Your brother will rise again.' Martha said to him, 'Yeah, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day.' And Jesus said to her, 'I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he will live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?'" Jesus had a different perspective on the situation of Lazarus than everyone else did. Everyone else was there for a funeral. Jesus came for a resurrection. And he saw things in a different way than the rest of the people there. So we've got David with a different perspective on things, Jesus with a different perspective on things, and I want to move real quick into Judges. I promise you I'm going to bring these all together. This whole message is not going to be this scattered. In Judges chapter 6, verses 11 through 12, Now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth tree, which was in Ophrah. Don't read that as Oprah. Which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, while his son Gideon threshed wheat in the winepress in order to hide it from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, "The Lord is with you, mighty man of valor." The angel of the Lord saw Gideon with a different perspective than Gideon saw himself, or than we would have seen him. In this verse, it says, Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress in order to hide it from the Midianites. And I'm using that to state, like, basically he was afraid. He was being cowardly and hiding. Now you might say, oh, maybe he was being smart because the Midianites would have gone and taken away the wheat or whatever. But if you read the whole story, you find out that Gideon, through the whole thing, was a cowardly, kind of very timid person who had a very hard time trusting in God. I mean, every move he made, God had to basically just walk him through it. Okay, come on, let's do it, and get him to where he actually went ahead and did what he was supposed to do. But when the angel of the Lord sees him, he calls him mighty man of valor. He doesn't come in and say, Gideon, you coward, you will one day become a mighty man of valor. He comes in and says, Gideon, mighty man of valor, the Lord is with you. He had a different perspective than anybody would have ever looked at Gideon at. And then finally in Numbers chapter 13, verses 30 through 33. Then Caleb quieted the people before Moses, and he said, "Let us go up at once and take possession, for we are well able to overcome it." I'll interject here real quick. This is the story of 10 spies were sent out to, 12 spies were sent out to look at the land that they were about to go into. And, God had told Israel, this is the land that I am giving you. They sent 12 people out to go look at it, do reconnaissance. 2 of them came back and they're like, let's go. God has given us this land. 10 of them go, no. And that's where we pick up in verse 31. But the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are. And they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone as spies is the land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. There we saw giants. The descendants of Anak came from the giants. And we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. Caleb had a different perspective on this situation than everyone else. Were, because I'll try to be grammatically correct occasionally, were the 10 spies wrong in what they physically saw? No, they really had giants. This land was hostile. This land was violent. This land had gigantic warriors protecting it. So what did Caleb see that was so different from what the 10 saw? Joshua too, but this verse only had Caleb's name in it. Well, let's look at what David, Jesus, the angel of the Lord, and Caleb all had different than everybody else. They had perspectives of victory. They did not have perspectives of defeat. They had the idea that the Lord is with them, and they had the idea that they could overcome anything that was set before them if God had told them, this is what you're doing. Well, in order to find out how they had that perspective, I think it's important to look at what they were doing before these situations came up. Because what I find is that all 4 of them, and actually if you go through the Bible and look at all stories of victory, everyone has this in common. How did they spend their time prior to the situations? David. At this point, he's a shepherd. But what we know about him is that he's very skillful on the harp. He was very skillful on a lyre. He was not a liar. He played a lyre. L-Y-R-E. He was skillful on it, and what did he do with that skill? He worshiped God. He played psalms to God. Not all of the Psalms that are recorded in Psalms, many of those came later, but this is what he was doing. He spent his time worshiping God, being in God's presence. He was so good at this that even before he came to this point of facing Goliath, he was called on to come in and drive out evil spirits from Saul. He was called, the presence of God was so strong with him that he was called to come in and bring rest to the king of Israel and help him to find peace in the midst of storms. He was called to come in and do this because he was a practiced worshiper of God. He spent time in the presence of God. He also spent time shepherding and doing the things that God had called him. God had made him be a shepherd so that when he became a king, he wouldn't rule as a dictator, he would rule as a shepherd. And so he was busy about doing the things God had called him to do and worshiping God. Jesus. What did Jesus do prior to coming to Lazarus? Well, we pretty much know what Jesus' life looked like, but I wanted to point out this verse from John 5:19. It says, Jesus answered and said to them, most assuredly I say to you, the Son can do nothing of himself, but what he sees the Father do. For whatever he does, the Son also does in like manner. So this is kind of an interpolation question. How did Jesus know what the Father was doing? If the only thing that Jesus could do was what he saw the Father doing, how did he know what the Father was doing? He spent time praying, worshiping, being in the presence of God. He spent that time getting to know the Father, being in his presence. And that's how Jesus spent his time. There's a lot of verses I could have pulled up as verses where it talks about how Jesus would get away early in the morning before the crowds would come or even before the disciples were up, and he would go and pray and spend time. But I think that we can all extrapolate from this verse that if he knew what the Father was doing, it's simply because he spent time listening, dwelling in his presence, being with him. The angel of the Lord. Okay. Well, first of all, there's a lot of opinion, and I actually share this opinion, that anytime in the Old Testament when it talks about the angel of the Lord, that they're actually talking about a pre-incarnate version of Jesus, that was Jesus. But that is not absolutely proven. So it could have just been a very significant angel. Either way, I don't think it matters. What did the angels do, including the angel of the Lord? Well, in Revelation 5:11 through 12, it says, Then I looked, and I heard the voice of many angels around the throne, the living creatures, the elders, and the number of them was 10,000 times 10,000, and thousands, with a loud voice, Worthy is the Lamb who was slain to receive power and riches and wisdom and strength and honor and glory and blessing. What's happening in this verse? It's worship. These are angels sitting in the throne. It says they're gathered around the throne. They're in the throne room. They're in the presence of God, worshiping him, spending time in the presence of God. And after spending that time in the presence of God, and then being sent out is when the angel of the Lord can look at a person hiding in a wine press and say, the Lord is with you, mighty man of valor, because I'm seeing things from God's perspective, not my own. And then Caleb. Well, we don't actually have a significant amount of information on Caleb prior to when he gets called to be a spy. But what we do know is afterwards, we see a little verse that talks about what Caleb's life was like. So in Numbers 14, 22 through 24, it says, Because all of these other men who have seen my glory and the signs which I did in Egypt in the wilderness, and have put me to the test now these 10 times, and have not heeded my voice, they certainly shall not see the land of which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who rejected me see it. But my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit in him, and he has followed me fully, I will bring into the land where he went, and his descendants shall inherit it. So we can pretty much look at this and realize all the things that he said the people didn't do, and now they won't see the land, Caleb did those. And he says, these are people who did not heed his voice. He says, Caleb followed me fully. It means Caleb, if he heeded his voice, understood what it was to hear from God, to listen to God. And if you're hearing from someone, you're spending time in their presence. You're getting that. And it says he had a different spirit in him. And I see that as a spirit of worship, as a spirit of trust and of faithfulness. And that's how he followed God. So every single one of these people and the angel all had a history of being with God. They all had this history of resting in his presence when there wasn't a battle. They didn't go into this and say, there's a battle, I better immediately get with God. It was, I just need to be with God. I just want to be with God. I want to look at what it looks like, because I'm sure no one has this experience, so we'll have to find an example of what it looks like to seek God after the battle has started. In 1 Samuel 4, 1 through 3, and the word of Samuel came to all of Israel. And Israel went out to battle against the Philistines, and they encamped beside Ebenezer. And the Philistines encamped in Aphek. Then the Philistines put themselves in battle array against Israel. And when they joined battle, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 men of the army in the field. And when the people had come into the camp, the elders of Israel said, "Why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord from Shiloh to us, that when it comes among us, it may save us from the hand of our enemies." You see, the ark of the covenant, the ark of the Lord, that represented the presence of the Lord. And whenever Israel was to go into battle, the ark of the Lord was supposed to go in front. They were supposed to take worshiping priests and singers and put them in the front and carry the ark into battle, and then the warriors followed. It's a picture of our lives. This worship and praise goes first. The warriors come second. They didn't do that. They were supposed to do that. They did not do that. Now, what happened to get them into this position where they were defeated? Well, if we go back to 1 Samuel 3:1 and we start looking at some of this backstory, it says, "Now the boy Samuel ministered to the Lord before Eli, and the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no widespread revelation." This is a picture of history where people simply weren't listening to God. It wasn't because God was withholding from his prophets or withholding from his people. It was simply there weren't people willing to spend time in the presence of God and listen to him. And in fact, that continues on in chapter 3, verses 11 through 14. "Then the Lord said to Samuel, 'Behold, I will do something in Israel at which both ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. In that day I will perform against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. For I have told him that I will judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knows, because his sons made themselves vile, and he did not restrain them.'" See, even the priests were rebelling against God. They're just doing their own thing, whatever they wanted. You know, we could go back and try to figure out what it means that they were being vile, but I'm just telling you, they weren't spending time in the presence of God. They weren't interested in what God was doing. They weren't listening to the voice of the Lord. They wanted to do their own thing. Then they go into battle, doing it their own way, because they've always been victorious, and they get defeated. And then we go back to that verse in chapter 4. And what do they say? "Why has the Lord defeated us?" You know, it's so funny. It's like immediately, I haven't cared anything about God. I haven't listened to him. I haven't spent any time in his presence. I didn't seek his face. I didn't ask him what I was supposed to do. I didn't do anything. I get defeated. Something goes wrong. And the first thing I say is, why did God do this to me? Why did God let this happen to me? Why does God hate me? And that's exactly what they were doing. And then after they blamed God for their failure, even though he was never asked to be a part of this, never sought, they then try to force God's hand by invoking a spiritual right from their past experiences. Oh yeah, if we have the Ark of the Covenant, we'll win. Well, that's what God told them to do, right? Bring the Ark of the Covenant. So they went and get the Ark of the Covenant. But what did they say? "Let us bring the Ark of the Covenant, that when it comes among us, it may save us from the hand of our enemies." They weren't looking for the presence of God. They were looking for a magic box. They were looking for the Ark of the Covenant from Raiders of the Lost Ark, the one they could open it up and melt all their enemies' faces with, right? They weren't looking for the presence of God. They wanted a tool to defeat their enemies. Oh, let's bring in the big guns. We'll go get the ark. The Philistines' response to that in chapter 4, verses 7 through 8, it says the Philistines were afraid. For they said, oh no, God has come into the camp. And they said, woe to us, for such a thing has never happened before. Woe to us, who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? These are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all the plagues in the wilderness. The Philistines understood the power of God. They messed it up a little bit, with all the gods and things like that. They got it a little bit wrong, but they understood that ark represented the presence of God, and they became afraid. Israel didn't have any respect for it. The Philistines did, because they understood the power. And the end result of this, after they bring the ark in, it says in verses 10 through 11, so the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated, and every man fled to his tent. There was a very great slaughter, and there fell of Israel 30,000 foot soldiers. And also the ark of God was captured, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. Phinehas? Basically, the result was defeat and devastation. This is what I see in a lot of believers' lives, is an unwillingness to just be in the presence of God, to rest in him during the off time, but a desperate calling on God during crisis. Now, do I mean to say, by sharing this story from the Bible, that God will not answer in time of crisis? No. He does it all the time because he's merciful, because he loves us. And there's a lot of examples in the Bible of times when God does intervene and he steps in last minute and saves people. And, that happens. But my thoughts on this is, why set myself up for that? Why not just set myself up to live a life of victory the entire time? In Joshua 3, 5 through 9, this is what it looks like when it was done right in Israel. Joshua said to the people, sanctify yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. He had already heard from God. God had given him a directive and said, you're going to do this, and I will do wonders. So he tells the people, we're going to do this. The Lord will do wonders among you. Then Joshua spoke to the priests, saying, take up the Ark of the Covenant and cross over before the people. So they took up the Ark of the Covenant, and they went before the people. They're doing everything the way God laid it out. We'll send the presence of God in first. And the Lord said to Joshua, this day I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. You shall command the priests who bear the Ark of the Covenant, saying, when you have come to the edge of the water of the Jordan, you shall stand in the Jordan. So Joshua said to the children of Israel, come here and hear the words of the Lord your God. And I will tell you that what happened is they went to the edge of the water of the Jordan. The priests put their feet in it. The entire river parted. They go across. They end up making camp. And a little bit later, they do the Battle of Jericho, which is one of the biggest victories of the Israel army. And the entire victory was done through supernatural means without losing a single person out of Israel. That's walking in victory. That's success. And it was done because Joshua spent that time with God. He got God's directive. He got God's voice, God's timing, God's imperative. And he put that all out into the Israel army. We talk a lot about freedom here at Grace. And I'm glad. I came from a very legalistic background. If you don't do this, God won't love you kind of background. I was joking with someone the other day, and we were talking about something, and I said, well, I grew up in a church where if you did that, that was a one-way ticket to hell. You immediately gone, but which, wasn't true, but that was kind of some of the teaching I was brought up in. And I'm thankful that we talk a lot about freedom. We believe that what we do does not give us salvation. We do not believe it gives us favor with God. We believe that only God gives salvation. It comes by grace, not from our own works. That's from a Bible verse. We believe that there's nothing I can do, good or bad, that will make God love me more or less. Okay? I absolutely, positively believe that. I do not believe that God accepts us or loves us based on our actions. But do not get me wrong. What we do matters. It doesn't matter in the sense of, will God love me? It does not matter in the sense of, will I lose my salvation? It does not matter in those senses of being acceptable to God. But what we do matters. In Galatians 5:13, Paul writes, "For you, brethren, have been called to liberty. Only do not use liberty as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another." This is Paul who talked about freedom a tremendous amount, and it is for freedom that Christ has set you free. Even these things like you can move in freedom. You're no longer slaves. You are free. You're children of God. But he also said things like, I would rather not ever eat meat again if eating meat caused somebody else to stumble. Was he free to eat? Yeah, absolutely. In this particular case, he was talking about meat sacrificed to idols, not the difference of being a vegetarian or carnivore. But the idea was, I will give up freedom if it means serving someone else. It means I am willing to do what it takes to walk in the presence of God. Yeah, I have the right to do anything. In fact, he even said everything. All things are now lawful for me. What he's meaning that is not all things are legal, I can do anything I want and I won't get a speeding ticket. He's meaning everything is now lawful for me and that God will love me. God has granted me salvation. He has forgiven me of my sins. If he's forgiven me of my sins and my future sins, then what I do is lawful. But, he follows that with, but not all things are good for me. Not all things edify me. Not all things are beneficial for me. You see where I'm going with this? What we're doing before the battle ever comes up determines the amount of victory we will have in that battle. And I'm not saying that it's not on God. Yes. When we face challenges in life, God walks us through them. But we can position ourselves to be victorious through God's power by spending that time with God. Because he speaks to us. He shows us what he's doing. We can then be about what the Father's doing. We can walk in that victory. Christian disciplines are important. They are not necessary for salvation. Do not get me wrong on that. They are not necessary for God to love you. But Christian disciplines are important. Just for different reasons than many of us have grown up to believe in. You don't have to pray. You do not have to read your Bible. You do not have to attend church, and you don't have to tithe. You also don't have to have victory, and you also don't have to walk an abundant life. God loves people who live in defeat just as much as he loves people who are victorious. But I would rather live in victory. And so that's why I believe in Christian disciplines. And I only bring that up this morning because, this is Grace Church. And we will talk a lot about grace. It's our name. It's so strong in Pastor Roger that the church was named Grace. It's a foundation of everything we do because it's so vital. It's so important to understand that everything is from God. It's not our own doing. But in the midst of hearing that, I also want you to know that we have a part in this too. Yeah, God loves you. God accepts you. But let's receive it. Let's do our part of receiving his love and then expressing that love back to him through prayer, through reading our Bible, through talking with others, through evangelism, through whatever God calls us to do. Let's do it. Let's spend time in his presence. Because when the battle comes, that's not when I want to. If I had to go and run a marathon right now, I would be in trouble. You can look at me and see I would be in trouble, okay? about a quarter mile into it, I'm going to collapse. If someone came and said, hey, you're going to do a marathon tomorrow, that's not the time for me to begin training. That's the time for me to start looking for excuses not to do it. If I want to run a marathon, I need to train now before I know it's coming. And then when I find out, I'm ready, I'm prepared, I've already trained for it. Do you understand what I'm saying? Let's spend that time with God. Understand the Christian disciplines. I think that this is a great timing for this. I really believe that this is what God was speaking to me, but it just so coincides with the fact that we've started up the Grace Life classes. And, we talk a lot about what it is to be a member here at Grace. Do we have expectations on people who want to be members? And the simple answer is yes. The longer answer is you are welcome to come to this church and sit in a chair and never talk to anyone and never participate in anything and then get up and leave and never talk. Just do it. And you can do that. But if you want to get stuff out of this, if you want your life to be transformed by the Holy Spirit, if you want God to change your situation and bring victory and bring abundant life into you, then I challenge you to get into it, to be a part of it, to get up and join a group, to join a discipleship program, to learn how to study your Bible, to pray with people, to minister to people, to learn how to share your faith, all of these things. Not so that God will love you. He loves you regardless. We do this so that we can start to experience victorious living, abundant life. I throw those words around. I defined them one other time when I preached, but I'll just real quick, what I think of as victory is that no matter what life throws at me, I can overcome it. It doesn't mean that I won't have trials. It doesn't mean I won't have a battle. It doesn't mean that things won't happen. It just simply means that God has given me everything I need to walk right through it and not be panicked, not, have anxiety. I can still sleep at night, and I know God's got me. Abundant life does not mean that I can quit my job and immediately just, have all the money I could ever need. Abundant life is that whatever situation I'm in, I'm filled with joy, and whatever God has called me to, I have enough resources to handle it. I can do it. God has called me to give, I can give. God has called me to be a part of something, I have the time to be a part of it because I walk in abundant life. Okay, that's what I mean by those things. So the last thing that I want to throw out there is just a real quick example of this is I read a story that said in 2018, the phrase people would most like to not hear again is fake news. Right? And I just really 100% agree with that. So that's why I'm going to talk about fake news. Now, what I wanted to say was, how many of you understand that honest to goodness fake news, and I'm not going to get political here, I just want to bring something up. If a writer goes and writes something that they just totally make up, completely make up, who is that benefiting? It's not benefiting our nation. It's not benefiting the reader. There might be some self-benefit. Maybe they can get that article to go viral, get their name out. Maybe they can put some ads on it, make some money, clickbait, whatever. But they're not helping anybody out. In fact, it very often brings harm because it's not the truth. And we're about the truth. And journalism is about the truth, right? It's supposed to be. Do they have the right to submit fake news? Yeah, absolutely. That's protected under our Constitution. Soldiers fight for the right for people to be able to do that because of freedom of speech. You can say, you can write it, but it's not beneficial. That is how our Christian life is. There are things we can do that we have the right to do. There are things that we don't do, and we have the right not to do them. But when we start living in truth and doing the things that are beneficial, that are edifying, that build up one another, then it helps not just us, but it helps the entire body of Christ. It brings us together in unity. It brings us together in strength, and it positions us to live under the leadership and the lordship of Jesus Christ. I want to invite our prayer team to come forward as I wrap things up. I'm bad about saying in closing, and because that's usually the cue that everyone stands up. But in closing, as we look forward to this new year, I want us to be able to look at things with the right perspective. So many people on social media, I noticed, wrote about 2017. And a lot of people, not everyone, but I saw a lot of people who wrote 2017 was one of the hardest years ever. 2017 had a lot of struggles. 2017 had, insurmountable challenges that I had to face. And then they would write things like, I sure hope 2018 is better. And I don't know what your 2017 was like. Mine was pretty good. But what I want to say is the way that 2018 can be better than 2017 is when we develop perspectives like Caleb, when we develop a perspective like Jesus, like the angel of the Lord, or like David, who, when you face the battles coming up, see, there won't be any real difference in the battles that you will face between 2017 and 2018. They're going to come. Goliath is going to meander into your life at some point. And he probably was there at some point in 2017. And you had a choice to either be afraid of him or to have the correct perspective of, who is this guy? What is the situation that stands between me and God? Whatever. We can have that perspective in 2018. Because Goliath may come into your life. The Philistines may stand there as an army before you. And we will either look at it and be afraid, or we will say, I've seen this before, and I know what God can do. I understand the power and the presence of God in my life. I want to choose to have that perspective for this year and every year after that. So, if you want prayer, come forward, and